You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the People Agenda podcast. My name is Chris Howard. I am the marketing director at Lace Partners, and today we are talking about HR's role in business transformation. If you are a regular follower of the work that we do at Lace Partners, you will be more than familiar with our work that we have just recently released or have been talking about for the best part of the last 6 months, really, which is around a campaign that we've got at the moment called Proactive People Transformation. And it's all around HR's influence in the wider world of business transformation. In September, we launched a white paper, and that white paper was off the back of some research that we did in the beginning, Q1 and Q2 of 2025. In that white paper, I'm going to get my co-host explain a little bit about why we did it and who we talked to and bits like that. But just as a bit of a framing exercise, we talked to 450 people of the C-suite because we were quite interested in finding out what is HR's role in not just HR transformation, but actually business-wide transformation. I'm going to stop there and introduce Julian, who's co-hosting with me today. Julian, you all right?
Yeah, really, Chris. Very pleased to be here.
Very pleased to have you as co-host with me. We have, as always, a guest. What we did with this particular white paper that we launched, it's called From Implementer to Influencer, HR's role in business transformation, is we got a special person, a special guest who's been on the pod before to do a little bit of a ghostwriting exercise. Although she's not really a ghostwriter now because we reference her and also she's in the pod itself. Katie Jacobs, how you doing? You all right?
I am very well, no longer ghostly. Thank you.
No, you're no longer ghostly. You're very much in full form. And Katie, myself and Julian are just going to chat about some of the interesting things that we found about the white paper. If you want to actually download the white paper, if you go to the Lace Partners website, there is actually a section at the top which is called downloads, and you can see and download that white paper. Just pop in a few details and you can go from there. But I think we should probably start, Julian, with talking about why. Before we get Katie involved, of course, we've got a fundamentally different question we like to do. I'm going to actually ask that now. Do you know what? I'm going to ask that now before we get to the details. And Katie, having done this before, I think you're familiar with this as well, but for those listeners who are not, just to kick off the show and a little bit of an icebreaker, we like to have a completely random and non-HR related question. I'm going to keep it nice and easy for you guys this time around. We're turning from nice summer, hot weather to cold, sort of autumnal things. So just tell me about one thing that you love about that. I'm going to or one thing you don't love about that. I'm going to kick off with a don't love, which is I don't love the fact that I've had to start putting on my jacket. But Julian, anything you love about the fact we're moving from summer to autumn?
Hardship. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm possibly one of the palest people in existence. So I love the autumn and the winter because it means I don't have to wear sunscreen and hats all the time during the summer months. But actually, do you know what? I love this run up now. I love Halloween. I love Guy Fawkes Night. I love Christmas. So to me, actually, this is one of my favourite times of year.
Oh, I love it. Katie?
I echo that. I love this time of year. I love fireworks night, especially. Something really good. What do I like? I like not having to shave my legs. I like having to put a jacket on. I like not having to put sunscreen on my children because they do not like that. But I do not like having to put a hat on them because they don't like that either.
There we go. If you are interested in telling us what you'd like to put on or not put on for a summer or in autumn or winter, then please let us know. But let's get back to the questions and the topic at hand, which is around this white paper that we've written. Julian, I guess just for a minute or two before we start getting some of the questions, getting Katie's thoughts on interesting things to pull out from the white paper, can you do a bit of a helicopter view as to why we thought that this is a topic that is interesting to HR teams and to businesses at the moment as well?
Yeah, for my sins, I used to work for one of the consulting firms many moons ago, and I don't think it's unfair to say that often when that firm was, I think some firms were brought in to deliver transformation programs, it was really variable about what the role that the CPO or the people team of the client would play in those. And actually, when I started with Lace 3 years ago, and it was almost immediately apparent to me that the landscape had changed. And we can speculate, Katie, you might have a view about why that is. I think CPO role being elevated through COVID possibly is a part. But I also think, and then we do allude to this into the paper, is we talk about business transformation and workforce transformation. Actually, I almost feel like we need to change the language around it, because slight cliche, I think transformation has become business as usual. I don't think that it's either economic or advisable from any point of view for many organizations to have to rely on consultants to improve their business. And therefore, Lace has a CPO network. We held a series of dinners to just start testing this hypothesis, which is, are we right? Actually, if you were to compare what people function today to people functions 5 years ago, 10 years ago, are you much more heavily involved in workforce transformation? And actually, the resounding answer was yes. In fact, many of our CPOs said, actually self-identified of what I was hired in by my CEO to be a transformation CPO. So that's incredibly positive, and we'll get into some of the content of the paper at the moment. But I think we also recognise, therefore, that potentially there were complications around that as well. And to my mind, what we wanted to do was get some validation from the market at a bigger scale rather than being pure anecdotal evidence. So that was what led to the commissioning of the research.
Yeah, and Katie, from your perspective, you've obviously been around the industry for a long time. You've worked in the CIPD, you've worked as a journalist for quite a while. So I'd love to get your thoughts on just Julian's framing there. But then actually, let's move into this first sort of question that I wanted to ask you, which is just if there's anything that particularly stood out to you, because of course, what you were doing as part of this exercise is helping us to write this white paper. But in addition to that, you were on the ground speaking to some CPOs and CEOs as well. So anything that particularly stood out to you based on what Julian was talking there about maybe reframing our perceptions of what this is and the role that HR is playing in transformation?
Just echo what Julian said about this kind of transformation not being a kind of one and done event. I think kind of planning for change, having these nice linear change programs that have a neat beginning, middle and end, doesn't really work right now. It's much more kind of cyclical and constant process, and nobody really has the time to stand still. We all hear if we don't innovate, basically you die as an organization. So all organizations are under an enormous amount of pressure. Obviously, we all know contextually in the wider environment, nobody is having a particularly easy time right now. So all that is just leading to an enormous amount of change, obviously driven as well by the kind of enormous amounts of technological and digital change that are going on around us. I agree with Julian. I think during the pandemic kind of elevated the expectation of what HR could do, which is great. A lot of HR functions and CPOs performed really well. They were very much at the right hand of the CEO and the COO in delivering the change that was needed to keep people safe and keep businesses running. That has, I think, really shone a spotlight on what HR can do, but what hasn't necessarily happened, as I think we can get into, is that the resources haven't necessarily increased in line with the expectations. So the kind of capability and capacity of HR teams to deliver on what they may be expected to do might be a little bit of a mismatch there. Definitely, you've got a lot more kind of transformational CPOs, people that are seen to be able to go in and shake up an organisation. I think that's a really exciting place where a lot of CPOs like to be. And then, once that's done, they move on to the next one. I think about what kind of things that stood out in the research. I think it was really heartening. We'll start on the positives and then maybe we'll go into some of the less positive bits to see that I think the appetite is there for seeing the role that HR can play in transformation. I think there is a recognition in most businesses that whatever kind of transformation you're doing, particularly maybe a tech one, if you don't get the people on board, then it is not going to deliver. It's not going to be sustainable, because ultimately everything comes down to buy-in and behaviour and whether people actually understand what you're trying to do. So I do think there is an understanding that if you can get the people side right, it will make transformation easier. It's never easy, a little bit more realistic and sustainable. So I think it did stand out to me that CEOs in particular do see that the CPO has a big role to play in taking a strategic view of transformation. Because I think in the past, it's been something that's been designed and then given to HR to implement. Whereas I think in the most kind of progressive and leading organizations where you've got a fantastic CPO that's really earned their seat at the top table, they are seen as a true partner. But maybe we can go on to why that isn't the case in every organization and what the barriers are.
Yeah, and maybe just one brief build on that, Katie, is one of those cliches that rattled down the sort of corridors of history was people functions wanting to have a seat at the table to play a more strategic role in the business. And I suppose in my mind, again, on the positive side of this is this transformation agenda actually is a huge opportunity. It doesn't get more strategic than supporting business transformation from my perspective. I don't know if you want to build on that at all, but that would be my view. It was in front of them all the time. But maybe we'll get into some of the reasons why perhaps until now it's been hard to grasp that opportunity.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity is, like you say, is there to play a kind of the most strategic role that HR could play. But there are all sorts of things. And I think something that actually did stand out to me, and I think I've done a couple of posts about it as well, is if you do not get the foundations right of what you're doing, and you lose the credibility to be operating at that level. But I think quite a lot of senior HR people can come a little bit disconnected, or it's seen as a little bit less sexy and interesting to get that operational stuff right. But without that bedrock, then you're firefighting the whole time. You keep getting sucked into not particularly strategic work because you're trying to fix things the whole time. And B, the experience that other functional leaders are seeing of what HR brings. You're talking a big game around the top table and in the C-suite, but the actual experience that people are having day to day of using HR operations is quite different. And I think if those two things aren't matching up, then that is why, Chris, maybe we can go into the fact that data found that although the CEO has quite a good view of what the CPO can offer, other functional leaders aren't perhaps as aligned in seeing that the value HR can bring. But it could be because the experience of the day-to-day operations of HR do not match up with the kind of big game that we're speaking about, bringing that strategic value.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. So just to put a bit of colour on what Katie, you're talking about there in the report, we talk about the CEO-CPO relationship. 62% of companies said that there was a close CEO-CPO relationship. But what's quite interesting is when we were actually putting the design part of this, I was talking to the guy that was designing it. He was saying, that doesn't sound very much. Like that means 38%. So 4 in 10 effectively saying that there isn't that close relationship. Julian, I'll start with you. And then Katie, if you want to just build on this, just get some thoughts around that. Because it's all very well saying, look, 62% are saying it's close. What about the other guys?
I've got a slightly different perspective on this because for my sins, I started my career in finance and strategy. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and actually it unfortunately lands on the CPO, but I think it's actually more inherent than that, which is most businesses, if you think about most things in a business wants to understand, count, measure, whatever it might be, use a bit of jargon now, they're fungible. If you're thinking about how much have we sold or how many factories do we have, to some degree, it's actually which factory, or it doesn't matter. You can add these things up and say it's the total. But as soon as you start talking about people are really, they're different from each other. They perform differently. The culture's different. Their expectations of work are different. Their productivity, in my view, we tend to stop people being productive or unproductive. Actually, I think that people's productivity varies massively depending on context, right? So the answer is that people are complicated, right? A lot of the sort of shorthand, a lot of the legacy that business is built on, which is we can add up numbers and we can see where we are. If you try to apply that to your people and your workforce, it doesn't, 2 + 2 doesn't necessarily equal 4 all the time. And I do understand that it's got a bit better, but certainly historically, for example, in business schools, if a senior exec has gone to business school, they would have spent far less time on issues to do with people and culture than they would have done, for example, on understanding financial engineering or operations or marketing, customer centricity, right? So I think that's part of it. And I'm certainly not blaming the other members of the C-suite. I think there's a lack of alignment sometimes around just what the framework is, what the language is, what the right metrics are. And if I've just come from an event and CPO there said the importance of co-developing for these service and operational aspects of HR, co-developing with the business, what those things look like, then meeting the needs of their stakeholders, not overwhelming them with data, but instead giving the insights they need to run the business. So I think there's a whole alignment piece in here that perhaps historically has been an area of development.
Yeah, Katie, I want to get your thoughts on this because obviously in the report, in one of the sections, we talk about 41% have said that the contributions from the HR people function is less tangible and measurable. And based on what you're talking about, the alignment there's 2 things really. So I'd love to just get your thoughts on this, Katie. The first one is my initial response, is that just the old adage of HR needs to get better at using the data and telling its story? But then the second bit, which I think is quite interesting, is something that I've talked about actually on a Less Stress HRS webinar that we did, which is about this idea of realizing the benefit realization of what you are doing, and not just let's pitch, we want some money for something, and then nothing we go away and do a bunch of work, HR, we embed a new piece of tech or whatever it is. We don't tell anyone about it until the end point at which we say, ta-da! And actually, one of the things that we've talked about, I know Liz Sanders in our team has talked about, is you need to be articulating those values. For each milestone, be telling people, like, this is what we're doing. This is the success we've got. This is the ROI that we've delivered. So, Katie, I guess two things there. Is this just a question of HR, CPOs be better, interpret data and tell the story better? Or is there also an element of that benefits realization and explaining those wins throughout the journey, as opposed to, I want money and I'll come back to you when I want money again?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think there will be in many organisations a need to get better at telling the narrative and using data more effectively. I would hope that most HR teams have got a lot better at that, because I feel like we've been talking about it for a very long time. But I wouldn't want to say that is like 100% solved across the board. But I do think it's this piece about, as you say, anchoring the people strategy and the people stuff in the business strategy, and the need for the CPO, and all good CPOs will say this, that they need wear a business hat as much as an HR hat, and when they're sitting around that table, they're not just bringing the people lens, they're able to contribute on issues far beyond that. And yes, I think that it is that kind of that grounding in a business case that is meaningful beyond the people function, because obviously the people function stuff matters, but how are you grounding that in what the business actually cares about as well? And how do you know what the business cares about? Have you actually engaged with those stakeholders at a level? And stakeholders are different, and different functional leaders will have different priorities. So a lot of it is almost small p political, getting around that table, having those conversations, building those relationships, and finding out what people's pain points are, and then how you can help them to remove those pain points, how what you do within the people function can make their lives easier, rather than HR can fall into the trap of this kind of initiative-itis, where you do stuff for the sake of doing it, for the sake of telling people that you're doing it, and for looking nice and busy. And I think one thing I've observed with the kind of journey that a lot of organizations have been on with people data over the years is 10, 15 years ago, people say we don't have enough data. Now it's almost like we've got too much data because we just started collecting everything, and then we report on everything and we tell people everything and drown them in it, almost, I think, because HR can be, and there is an external narrative around that, not good at numbers and not good at data that isn't particularly helpful. So in an attempt to prove that they are, gone a little bit over the top, rather than thinking about sometimes less can be more, and what are the different areas or priorities that different functions will have that are obviously embedded into the kind of wider business strategy.
So I suppose one of the other things as well, I think HR has struggled with a bit is, shall we say, not only often they're telling the business that they've got a problem, and if only they'd done something 6 months ago or 12 months ago, they wouldn't have the problem, which is of course always frustrating, I think, for anybody. One of the things we asked the respondents was about the degree to which they use long-term strategic workforce planning to consider how the business is evolving and how that might support the transformation agenda. I think 53% said that was true. I'll be honest with you, that sounds a bit optimistic to me, but what's your view, Katie?
Yeah, I think it's so organisation dependent. Yes, perhaps that is a little bit over optimistic. And when we think about strategic workforce planning, what do we really mean by strategic workforce planning? I guess would be my question. Like, how far ahead are you able to plan now? How is that relating to all this other kind of lot of hype around things like skills-based organizations and stuff right now, and how your organizational architecture is going to change in the face of rebuilding around skills or rebuilding around using AI and automation? So I think there are some interesting questions for HR, because planning always sounds great, doesn't it? And we want to be able to plan ahead, but it needs to be agile planning, small a, agile, it needs to be dynamic. And I think that can be a struggle for organizations. It's hard to plan ahead for kind of 5-10 years. Maybe that's pointless now. So how do you do that in a dynamic way that allows you to flex and pivot as you need to?
I think we talked about the context and also to some degree what some of the gaps are. And if you could summarize that fundamentally to capacity being one of those elements. Have you got any thoughts on the other thing that was cited was capability as well, and whether the HR function had the capability to support business? So even if they had the capacity, would they have the capability to support transformation? You've got some views on that?
Yeah, there's perennially issues about kind of HRBP capability, aren't there? And whether HRBPs have the capability to do the job as it's designed, or as that you would hope it would be. Like, do they have the capability to operate at a strategic level? I think some of it can be a little bit unfair. I think some of it is on the business. Is the business asking the right things? Has the business been almost been told the expectations that they should have of that role, or are they pulling them back into the operational stuff? It's the point I made at the beginning about the operations keep breaking. Then it's quite a kind of comfortable place for a lot of people to be firefighting that and to be very reactive and to be solving people's queries and solving people's problems a lot. And I think that, like I say, that can be quite a comfortable place to be drawn back into. You feel very busy and you're being very useful because you're solving people's problems like immediately that they ask. So I think there is a little bit of an education piece to the business around what does good strategic kind of HR business partnering look like, and then also making sure that you have that operational capacity and capability in place so that HRBPs aren't forever getting pulled back down into that. But obviously there is a bit of capability building that needs to be done on the part of HR, and this is such a cliche, so sorry, but HR can be very cobbler's children when it comes to its own development, so developing the rest of the business and investing in the skills of others, but not taking the time to do it for themselves. And I think when it comes to transformation, that is an enormous miss, because often HR is doing two transformations at once simultaneously. So it is supporting the business's wider transformation, and alongside that often comes functional transformation, because you need to be probably transforming your operating model alongside it. HR might be supporting the business on restructures, only knowing that at the end it's going to have to totally restructure itself, and a lot of those people are going to be moving on, leaving the business, moving into different roles. So this kind of need to do two things simultaneously, I think, is quite a challenge that as a function other functions don't necessarily have. So if you're not giving your people the skills to be able to handle that, then you're doing them a bit of a disservice. So that kind of ensuring that you're investing in giving them the skills they need to do transformation, I think, is a little bit on the HR leadership, because otherwise you potentially are setting people up to fail.
I do want to get to, so I want to ask a question around, because one of the bits we asked was like the future changes to the HR function. Before I do that, I'm almost going to turn the question that you asked Katie onto you there, because I'm really interested to get your view on this idea of having 41% or that HR saying it's got limited analytical capability. Because you obviously went along as part of this, as part of this exercise. One of the things we did was we didn't just interview and do quality focus groups. So you attended a few dinners and you spoke to a number of workforce transformation specialists, CPOs and things like that. Julian, from your perspective, when you were sat with people in that room, what was the kind of gut feel that you got on that area of we don't really have the analytical capability, or what were the barriers that you remember people started to talk about?
Yeah, it's trying to think of a succinct way of saying this, but what strikes me is I think the whole, if you like, the people analytics agenda, if I can put it like that, I think it really started maybe sort of 10, 12, 14 years ago, something like that. And what's interesting to me is a lot of those efforts, particularly in the early years, it struck me, was largely focused on answering the HR functional agenda. And I think what is beginning to change now. So if I think about the last couple of people analytics conferences I've been over the last 2 years, you see far more people talking about how they're deploying people analytics to support genuine business questions. And I think to my mind, that's all part of this mindset shift, if you like, from HR being about providing HR services, HR stewardship to the business, to playing more of that problem-solving, strategic, shaping type role. So as Katie already said, there's no shortage of data in HR anymore. What there is almost is a sort of an agenda and a prioritization around, can I put it like this, around the people strategy, the business-driven people strategy, as opposed to the HR strategy, the functional remit of the function. So I see loads of opportunity there. That said, and one of my every so often I bump into old colleagues and things, and they've got roles in industry, and I meet people who are heads of org design, heads of SWP, heads of people analytics. And it's not universally true, but it is surprising how often they say, no, I don't really talk to my counterparts. I don't really talk to the people analytics person, or I get some data from the people analytics team. And I think probably even more, for me, the even bigger opportunity is when I say, and how about partnership with finance or with IT or with the COO on solving business problems together? So for me, and of course, there are brilliant examples, right? Don't misunderstand me, absolutely fantastic practice out there, but I don't think it's universal. And again, to me, it's just such a huge opportunity, not just for HR's sake, but actually to the business, because they're missing that people dimension. If they don't understand how the people dimension drives business performance, that's a huge miss. There was a great example actually again from the conference just come from very large name global retailer. I've stolen this from David Green shamelessly. I think he stole it from someone else, so that's okay. Yeah, he was talking about looking at retail, one of the biggest retailers. Essentially, they make 20% more profit in stores where they have high employee engagement compared to mid-level employee engagement. And essentially the HR team have managed to get $1 billion investment to improve employee engagement in their stores. Wow. And David met up with her recently and said, how's it going? And she said, this year I've got $2 billion to spend on employee engagement. Well, so that to me is a great example of how you've got, what does the business care about? Store profitability. I've got a metric a people metric that shows how a people metric is, presumably they did the stats, strongly correlated with business performance. And then all of a sudden that becomes an investable proposition on behalf of that business.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's a really interesting anecdote as well. Fabulous stuff. We're almost out of time, Katie. So I just want to do one final sort of question. I guess it's linked to that future changes to the HR function. So I guess it's more any thoughts. We've touched on some of this, I think, and certainly, well, in some of our other podcasts that we've done, we talk about the various different areas of this, but we asked around what are the future changes that you see? And I think not a lot of things surprised me too much, but I just wanted to get maybe just a minute or two, Katie, from you, and then a minute or two from you, Julian, to wrap up on some of these key things that were pulled out by the C-suite that we interviewed. So it was all around what are the future changes that they can see. It's integration of AI, shift to skills-based hiring. I think that's an interesting one because I often wonder how much is that really happening within businesses, this skills-based hiring piece. Expansion of remote and hybrid, which I'm going to put my cards on the table now. I'm getting absolutely sick to death I'm talking about, but that's just me. Advancements in people analytics. Obviously, we've just talked about that. You've given a really good anecdote, Julian. Emphasis on well-being and mental health, implementation of enhanced employee surveillance tools, increasing focus of DEI, adoption for augmented reality, VR, which again, I think is an interesting one because it feels like that's been around a long time, but I don't know whether or not that's actually being adopted. Any surprises there for you, Katie? Anything that you would say I'm surprised that they didn't pull out something else or do you know what, free swim, even if you just want to pick one of those and say, do you know what, this is interesting for me because of X, Y, or Z.
I'm quite allergic to hype because I'm a journalist, so I'm meant to be skeptical. Yeah. I think there is a lot of talk around a lot of tools being implemented. It is very hard to find examples of people who are willing to talk about it. I think there was some McKinsey research, wasn't there, the other day about the lack of ROI that is coming out of use of generative and agentic AI. And interestingly, on the skills-based hiring piece, I spoke to a couple of big organizations recently who've gone down that road and are now coming back from it because they can't make it work for them because all of this is so systemic. It comes down to the kind of the job, like the kind of organization design and job architecture, and to unravel all of that and just build it back is a massive job. It is a enormous transformation that HR should be involved in leading. I think a lot of organizations are maybe doing stuff in kind of all these little pilots. And if you're not seeing the whole picture, then how are you going to get value from those pilots? So I need to step back and see the whole picture. I thought maybe it'd be useful I'll quickly just run through, so I'm looking at the paper right now, the kind of five topmost valued traits for a CPO for the future. Being a trusted advisor to the C-suite. So what I'd pull out there is just the need to make sure you're focusing on building those relationships beyond the CEO. Obviously, that CEO relationship is really important, but what about the CEO? It's all about the CFO, the COO, the CTO. A driver of cultural and behavioral change. I think as we get into talking about HR's role in transformation, we can focus a lot on the kind of systems and the platforms and the tools, but ultimately understanding behavioral change is a really important key that HR Can't forget that is something we are expert in. It's just how we talk about that. A champion of workforce agility, so building cultures that embrace change, having that flexibility and kind of operating and hiring models. A strategic business leader, so wearing that business hat, not just bringing the people lens to everything, and an enabler of transformation, which I guess is what the entire paper is about.
Yes, indeed. We're basically out of time. Really great stuff. Thank you very much, Katie, for getting us on. Julian, any kind of final thoughts or anything you want to wrap up on in terms of the paper? I'm the marketing guy, so I would say you can download the white paper. Please download the white paper. But from your perspective, any kind of final thoughts you want to wrap up on?
No, really just say, look, I think it's really nice. I think this has genuinely been widecast pieces of research. Of course, it won't, specifics of it might not apply to a particular organisation, your organisation, for the listener. What I would say is hopefully at least there's some themes in here, some resonance that you begin to think about. Lace, we're really happy to be working with a number of clients at the moment where we are helping them build the capability around workforce transformation. But we're always interested to reactions, counterpoints of view. And if you have a strong view on this, and I'm sure Chris would love to have you on the podcast, and you can give us your viewpoint. So we would look forward to that. So thanks for listening.
Yes, absolutely fantastic. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to this as much as we've enjoyed recording it. Katie, thank you very much for joining us and chatting through the paper today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, always a pleasure. Julian, thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we're going to catch you next time on the People Agenda podcast. See you later. Bye.